So let's move right ahead. A second. Okay, so I like this quote that I saw on one article. There are decades where nothing happens, and then weeks where decades happen. And obviously, I'm sorry. Okay, so it's clear there's lots going on. It's being called unprecedented. I think it is. There's lots of uncertainties rather than definites. And therefore, my presentation is going to have more questions than answers. I want to start by just showing, and I lifted this, you can see the references on many of my slides for the content in these little purple blocks. So this was lifted from this particular article. I'm not going to go through all of it. You can look over it. I will call out a few points which I thought were really interesting. You know, going from an office by default to remote by default, and an office only for necessity and community and things of that nature. Going from stupid bullshit to actual issues, I think this really focuses the mind. And I think going from complacency to action. So I've got lots to cover, so I'm going to go quite quickly. It's just 4 slides, but there's a lot of content. I'm going to talk about, actually it's the general presentation, I'm going to talk about what's happening, what the implications are of what is happening, and then I'm going to end with what we should do about it. So starting with a global perspective and looking over the short term, the medium term, and the long term, what do we see happening? And then I'll get to South Africa. I think one of the previous speakers mentioned the change in the global order. Already we're seeing North Asia versus Anglo-America and the Romance countries. So North Asia, particularly being China, Korea, and Japan, showing pretty phenomenal success, while the UK, the US, France, Italy, and Spain are really in a disastrous situation. Just a couple of numbers. I know everyone's seen lots of numbers, but those 5 countries, the US, the UK, France, Italy, and Spain, are 7% of the world's population, yet they have 60% of the confirmed cases, if you believe the numbers, and 75% of the deaths so far. And obviously that's rising significantly. Obviously, what we also see now already is a global recession. There's talk about mental health issues. I like the term physical distancing rather than social distancing. There's an encouragement, partly because of the mental health issues, but just in general, because we're people, that we connect socially via mediums like today's. And hopefully that term will get some traction. It's not my term, but I think it's a more useful term than social distancing. So that's the short term while we're in lockdown, us and the rest, half of the rest of humanity. In the medium term, when we're in unlocking, what does that mean? There's lots of uncertainties. Will there be a resurgence? Will there be a mutation of the vaccine, of the virus? What's the timing for when treatment will become available and a vaccine? The 12 to 18 months does seem to be a consistent figure that we're hearing, and even that would be heroic, given that the typical time to take a drug to market is 5 years. Ebola was done it's 15 years. Ebola was done in 5 years. And so, and that was an emergency situation. So to get this down to 18 months would be pretty impressive. And then the big question in terms of the pace of the economic recovery. For some detailed analysis, you can look at McKinsey's scenario analysis, where they sketch 9 different views as to how the economy might recover. But suffice to say that the predictions of the recession for this year are pretty dire. Goldman Sachs has it at -6%, and McKinsey has it ranging between -8 and -13%. And I think people are leaning towards that more concerning view. And then in the longer term, after we've unlocked, and who knows how long that will be, but once we're in a post-COVID world, what does that mean from a geopolitics perspective? And I think Graham spoke about a change in the global order, with China and others looking more favorable. But there are these questions like, will we turn inwards as countries, become nationalistic, isolationist, protectionist, populist, etc., or will we recognize a common enemy like this virus and like climate change and so forth, and work in a connected, trusting, cooperating manner, which of course, I suppose we all hope that will happen. What will happen regarding government control? Right now, the government, through contact tracing and things like that, is looking at our data here in South Africa as well as other parts of the world. Sometimes the technology is being used to a far greater extent in some countries, Korea, China, Israel particularly. But will the control and the visibility be relinquished? Or will government capitalize on the fact that all of this can be known about their citizens all of the time? And then, of course, as everyone's mentioned, there'll be new ways of working, learning, and living. I think our approach as individuals and as companies to how much leverage we have and how we treat savings will differ. Commercial real estate's been mentioned. Certain industries will be fundamentally transformed. That's been mentioned as well. And in South Africa, we have all of that, and we have national debt. And I want to talk more about that. I'm not an economist, so forgive me if I get some of this wrong, but a broad perspective. I think that we have a national security crisis already, and it's developing. And I mean national security from the perspective of obviously from a health perspective, but also from a food security perspective, possibly from a crime perspective. Our local response has been admirable so far, but there's some big questions on our sustainability to fund this, and that's what I want to dive into. The main message is that I think we are already struggling to fund this and will continue to fund it, and the scale of the crisis is not yet known. So this is a complex chart, and I'm going to talk through it very quickly, but I'm just trying to convey some key messages. The national security, as I already mentioned, they are welfare financing needs, there are basic needs like food, and there are healthcare needs in terms of facilities and staff and so forth. Healthcare is going to be driven by the extent of mortality and morbidity statistics that emerge, which will be driven by the effectiveness of the lockdown, by whatever winter might mean, if it's seasonal or not, and by our population's comorbidities, HIV, TB, hypertension, which we know exacerbates the negative statistics. We know there's a global recession. It's driving a South African recession, and we know that it's collapsed the capital markets. It's going to drive unemployment. EdCon is possibly not going to make it, so we'll see bankruptcies of large organizations and many small organizations as well. This will lead to driving the welfare requirements, the basic needs, because unemployment will possibly skyrocket, as we've seen in the US. Pension funds are eroded, and that's also going to mean that people can't rely on those pension fund payouts, which again drive those needs. So that's why I think we have a national security crisis. On the flip side, how to fund that? Well, our tax dollars are being eroded by people not being employed, not paying tax, companies not in business, not paying corporate tax, and a lot of the skills base that the higher earning workers have emigrated, not paying tax. Global recession means that we've got no one to sell to, so we have less foreign income. The rand weakening and the junk bond status with the poor credit rating that we have means it's expensive to borrow. Donor funds are a possibility, but those donor funds are not necessarily targeted for South Africa. Africa is being spoken about, and where in Africa it will go, we don't know. So how much will come to South Africa? All of this amounts to, I believe, a crisis regarding government's ability to fund this national security crisis that we are facing. In addition to all of this, there's second-order effects, third-order effects, higher-order effects. There's big questions in terms of what unlocking strategy we're going to follow and what will happen to Eskom and SAA, and possibly there's some positives in that. So I just want to offer my perspective on all of this. My perspective is that we cannot rely on the hope of getting donor funding. We don't want to rely on expensive borrowings, which is going to raise our national debt and put us in slow economic growth for decades to come. There's going to need to be some of that. It will be expensive. We don't want to have a massive reliance. In my opinion, we need to get the economy going as quickly as possible. And so the question about extending lockdown, I know is a question, but I also think it's worth recognizing that we have three groups of people in this country. We have those who are ill with COVID-19, and we already know about some of those, maybe not all of those. We have those that are old or ill and therefore highly vulnerable to the disease should they get it. And then we have those that are low risk, which is probably most of the people on this call, productive working people at all levels of our society. In my opinion, we need to do what other countries have done, the so-called hammer and dance. The hammer is to lock down quickly, which we've done. The dance is to unlock strategically and carefully and in a phased manner, as somebody already mentioned. And my view is we need to move to that as quickly as possible. So, and then this final quote from Tito Mboweni. Okay, so just to close off then, a couple of recommendations. What should we do? I think we need to take note of what we've learned over here. It's not going to be the last time that we face crises. We need to develop, if we don't have, or dust off if we do, a business continuity plan to deal with now, with the near term, and with the next time that this happens. And then in parallel with that, we need to strategize. And we need to strategize by developing scenarios now for both the medium term and for the long term. And then we need to develop an unlocking strategy, a medium-term strategy, and a long-term, a post-COVID-19 strategy. I think those are two different strategies. We need to revise our strategies to be robust under these scenarios. So just quickly, and there's a reference at the bottom, I wrote about this if you want more detail, but I think most people are familiar with the concept of strategies. These are alternative descriptions of, well, sorry, these are descriptions of alternative future worlds. The point is there are so many uncertainties, we can't say with any definitiveness what world we will be moving into. So we need to imagine alternative worlds, and those are what the strategies are. And then we need to make sure, sorry, those are what the scenarios are. And then we need to make sure that we are developing strategies that can be robust under those alternative worlds. This has always been known about theoretically. This has been used by some companies. I think what COVID-19 has demonstrated is that it hasn't been used enough, and it needs to be part of our toolkit in terms of how, as leaders of organizations, this needs to be how we do strategy. And then point number 6, we need to execute with resilience. And that means to be purpose-driven in what we are doing, so to know why we are doing what we are doing. We need to be reality-facing, seeing reality for what it is, and not believing our own bullshit as we have a natural tendency to do otherwise. And we need to be improvising, which means adapting and being agile and moving with agility as the uncertain future unfolds. And lastly, I know I've been a bit dire on the previous slide, so to end with a bit of a silver lining, there are silver lining points here. This can be seen and should be seen as a dress rehearsal for future big challenges, and as the potential, we should look for the potential to globally collaborate to face those big challenges, like the climate change issues, the nuclear risk that we face, cyber risk that we face, and the like. And I think people have seen the sort of second order effects: less pollution, less road deaths, less crime, finding, as the last speaker mentioned, new, better ways of working, learning, and living, giving more attention to the homeless that have been ignored until now, developing resilience as a nation, and particularly speaking from Cape Town, where we dealt with massive water shortage crisis. So, water, electricity, and now pandemics, this can all strengthen us. And this can also serve to help us remember what's important about our lives and those that we live with and work with. So let me close at that point, because I think I'm at my 15 minutes.